think people really believe that, if I was innocent, I would go to trial and I'm gonna be found not guilty and everything's gonna be great. And we know that that's not true.
Mandatory minimums are scenarios where if a client of mine is convicted of a particular crime, a judge has no discretion but to sentence that individual to a mandatory minimum sentence. Typically it's a prison sentence. Oftentimes it's a life prison sentence, and it doesn't matter what the client's background is, what their prospects are for rehabilitation.
Mandatory minimums are how a prosecutor coerces or scares my clients into pleading guilty. They don't want to risk 20 years. They're innocent, they didn't commit the crime, but all of a sudden a trial becomes a crap shot of an all or nothing equation.
That's not a system that's based in truth. It's not a system that's based in being fair to people. It's a system that is just letting prosecutors wield their power however they please.
The legislatures were concerned that judges were being too lenient, and they didn't like the discretion that the judges were having to take into consideration the specifics of the charge or the specifics of the individual.
If there are unique circumstances about the offense, the judge is powerless to impose any lesser sentence than the mandatory minimum.
You imagine the scales of justice, right? And you've got Lady Justice in the middle and balancing both sides to determine guilt or innocence, and if found guilty, then the consequences. When the prosecutor charges a mandatory minimum charge, they take the judge out of that equation. There is no balancing act. All of the power is on the side of the prosecutor.
It becomes a power play from the prosecutor's office to say, either implicitly or explicitly, take this deal on this lesser charge with this lesser amount of time, or face the possibility of a mandatory minimum sentence if you take this case to trial, and usually that minimum term is life. So in those scenarios, there really are no choices left for our clients or the accused in that situation, and they are essentially strong-armed into taking offers because the risk on the other side is way too grave.
And very few people are willing to gamble with 20 years of their life. Even people who are innocent will plead guilty to a charge that doesn't have a mandatory minimum rather than facing the potential consequence of a 20-year mandatory minimum.
Since 1980, the prison population has more than quadrupled. To put that into perspective, that means 1 out of every 100 adults is locked up.
I'm not aware of any evidence that mandatory minimum prison sentences increase public safety or restore victims of crimes any better than alternative sentences or provide better rehabilitative means. In fact, I would argue that what ends up happening is we have people that are serving disproportionately long prison sentences for crimes they committed as young people, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that don't need to be in prison. They are no longer a risk to the community. They've been rehabilitated, and they are ready and fit to come back into our communities.
One of my colleagues had a case where his client was charged with a burglary of a dwelling. In this case, no one was in the home. It actually belonged to a family member of his. There was some evidence that he wasn't supposed to be there, and he took 1 can of beer. So they were able to charge it as a burglary. And due to the mandatory minimum requirements in Florida, that client went to trial, was found guilty, and got 15 years for going to a family member's house and taking a can of beer.
Mandatory minimum sentences are one size fits all. There's no room for nuance, there's no room for circumstance, there's no room for the background of the offender to be considered, there's no room for the unique prospects of the offender for their rehabilitation. There's actually no room for victim empowerment or victim voices to help ascertain what the best outcome is relative to the victim.
We need to insist on the high school civics class version of what we're taught is the balance of powers and how the courtrooms are supposed to work.
We have to start reimagining alternatives to prison, because that's where this mandatory minimum is coming from, right? It's like, okay, like we can give people either prison or more prison. So we'll just figure out a more prison alternative, when we now know that there are so many other alternatives that we can use to actually make sure that people are safe, and also to make sure that when people come back into their communities, they can be productive and live productive and safe lives. Not a lot of people get involved in their local elections and electing the district attorney or the state's attorney, and that is the person that defines criminal justice in your county. If you are in a county that is having a prosecutor's election coming up, please educate yourself about who those prosecutors are. If you really want to change the law, because that's where mandatory minimums come from, start to find advocacy groups in your area that are working on that, and lobby your legislators, tell them that you don't believe mandatory minimums are right, and we have to have a long-term goal of changing the law.